Consider, you're a young person living in America. The Cold War is at its height. Actual hot war rages against communism in East Asia. New movements and ideals are circulating around the nation. Technology is fast growing, and culture is being transformed thanks to the unprecedented prosperity of post-war America. One area in which culture is being transformed is in the medium of television. Television is still quite new at this time, but even at this early date, fascinating and groundbreaking shows are catching your attention. If you are young, there is one in particular that you are very likely to be watching. It's a sci-fi show with a vision of a future humanity in which peace and prosperity have become universal. It involves a crew of brave adventurers travelling through space, exploring strange new worlds and facing off against terrible perils. The core cast of this sci-fi show are a lovable trio with a deep bond. We have a noble leader, a sometimes ill-tempered but good-hearted rascal, and an outsider from another world. It's 1950 and you're watching
Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. Space Academy, USA, in the world beyond tomorrow, 2350 AD. Here the Space Cadets train for duty on distant planets. In roaring rockets, they blast through the millions of miles from Earth to far-flung stars and brave the dangers of cosmic frontiers, protecting the liberties of the planets, safeguarding the cause of universal peace in the age of the conquest of space.
Tom Corbett tells the stories of 3 space cadets training to be officers in the Solar Guard during the 24th century. We have Tom Corbett himself, the leader, Roger Manning, the ship astrogator, who is something of a rebel, and Astro the Venusian, who is the rocket engineer. We follow their adventures aboard the Polaris, as well as those of Captain Strong, Dr. Joan Dale, and many other members of the Solar Guard as they uphold the liberties of the planets. Sadly, most of the Tom Corbett TV series has lost media, but the books and comics still exist, as do most of the radio series, and enough of the TV show exists that one can get a feel for it. In many ways, it's exactly what you'd expect from a sci-fi show at the time. It has very basic effects that often aren't quite good enough for the stories it's trying to tell, and was clearly made on a shoestring budget. But for all that, I think it's worth giving it a closer look. That was a bit of a gimmicky opening comparing Tom Corbett to Star Trek, but I had my reasons. I've always been fascinated by forgotten media, especially when that media was once a big deal. Movies that were box office successes but are little regarded today. Authors like Lloyd C. Douglas and Edward Butler Layton, who were both bestsellers in their day but are now all but forgotten. And of course, sci-fi shows like Tom Corbett. And Tom Corbett was big in its day, really big. From what I've read, when it was first aired, Tom Corbett was much bigger than Star Trek would be in its initial run. According to Wikipedia, it was the only show in history to be shown on all the major television channels in the USA. And it wasn't just a TV show. This was a genuine multimedia franchise. There were comics, a radio show, a book series, a lot of merchandise, and even cute children's picture books. But now, I wouldn't be surprised if most of you haven't even heard of it. Most of the TV show episodes have been lost, perhaps for good. And whilst most of the radio show and all of the comics and books remain, few still read them. But forgotten books, authors and TV shows can sometimes tell us more about their time than a series that prospered can. This is partly because a show that appealed to the era it came from, but not our own, can tell us what was unique about that era. A show that succeeded only for a time tells you something specific about that time, or maybe something specific about our own. But it is also due to the way we watch older shows, especially ones that are part of big capital F multi-generational franchises. When you watch Star Trek, you aren't just watching the show from the 60s. you are also conscious of everything that's happened to the franchise since, and this can get in the way of viewing the show as it really was at the time. Or to put it another way, is it possible to watch Space Seed without thinking about the way these characters will be expanded upon and grown in The Wrath of Khan, and in some ways imagining that this all existed in embryo in 1967 when the episode first aired? The weight of the future bears down on every episode of the original series that you watch. But Tom Corbett has been shielded from all of this. There have been no reinventions. There have been no remakes. There are no critical controversies or fandoms. There have been no retcons shaving the edges of odd pieces of canon that are no longer politically correct. Looking online, I was able to find exactly one piece of fanfic of the series in existence. Thus, one has no difficulty viewing the show as it is, rather than as it has been reinterpreted and rethought over the decades. In this channel, I hope to look at forgotten pieces of science fiction and see what they can tell us about the times and cultures that made them. So let us look at Tom Corbett and see what it can tell us. This won't be exactly a review of the franchise, more of a wander through, and a comment on those aspects that catch my interest or can highlight something about the culture that produced it.
Shh. Know what? Yesterday morning, Mother and I were up before anyone else in the house, and we had breakfast all by ourselves. It sure was fun. Jeepers, I could hardly wait to dive into those wonderful Kellogg's cornflakes.
So big, so crisp, so good to eat, so different from other cornflakes. Do they taste wonderful. And what fun Peggy had going strong all morning long. It's easy to see that she has more punch till lunch. Easy to see her mother's wise to the power in Kellogg's cornflakes. And wise to how simple it is to serve Kellogg's cornflakes, too. So if you want to enjoy breakfast and the whole morning, get the cereal that helps give you more punch till lunch. The world's most popular ready-to-eat cereal, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. The original.
Tom Corbett is an unashamedly commercial show. This is clear from the very first scene. Most shows are commercial in the sense that they are ultimately made to make a profit, but Tom Corbett is more blatant than most. Just look at the opening. I didn't play the whole thing earlier. This is the actual beginning.
Kellogg, the greatest name in cereals, presents Tom Corbett, Space Cadet.
I find it fascinating that the first word here isn't Tom Corbett or anything about space travel, but Kellogg's. I have no idea whom the early sponsors of Star Trek were, but you can't watch or listen to a single episode of Tom Corbett without hearing about Kellogg's. The franchise was also very into merchandising, which is heavily advertised in both the TV and radio show. And I'm not just talking about the ad breaks. Look at this scene, which occurs right in the middle of the episode.
How are we doing, Tom?
Oh, okay, Astro. Maintaining course and speed as ordered. We'll head back to the academy as soon as we finish this leg of our patrol.
Oh, good. Letter from home?
Mm-hmm. From my brother. They gave it to me just before we blasted off. What a kid. Look what he sent me.
A membership certificate?
Mm-hmm. He and all the fellows and girls in his neighborhood have joined the unit. Now, he wants to make sure that I belong.
But doesn't he know that you started the unit, Tom? Look, it's even named after you.
Well, I guess he doesn't want to take any chances.
You know, this was a good idea of yours, Tom. Starting a cadet unit outside the academy, I mean. Should make all of the younger boys and girls real interested in space. You know, make them want to join the academy when they get older.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the idea, Astro. That's why Commander Arkwright and Captain Strong decided to give me a hand with it. You know, gave me permission to send out shoulder patches and rings, just like ours.
Well, I sure hope everybody joins up.
I am counting on it, Astro. It's the first step to becoming a real spaceman.
I like to imagine that if you were a kid during the 50s, these little Solar Guard membership certificates would have been the best thing ever. I certainly think they're cool. They have the Solar Guard oath and everything, and the rings and all the rest can be found online, together with a vast amount of various Corbett merchandising from the time. But I do find incorporating advertisements for them into the actual main show a bit much. Considering that this show began in the year 1950, when most households didn't even have a television, it is remarkable how completely it is integrated with advertisers at such an early date. Remarkable to me at least. I'm sure to those who better know the history of television it might be to be expected. But this close integration of the show and its merchandising has an interesting artistic effect. One is continually reminded by the characters themselves that this is a show from the 50s, and the watcher is encouraged to interact with it as if the events occurring in the show are happening in the present. If you're watching it in the 50s, you literally have the character talking about you signing up to a club which Tom Corbett set up and which his little brother is a member of. Despite it being a show supposedly set in the future, the Tom Corbett series seems to treat itself more like something that the children that watch it are meant to imagine occurring just outside their window. And oddly, it's not just in its advertisements or promotions that the show does this. In the radio series, Tom Corbett makes in-character appeals for donations to victims of flooding. But perhaps the most interesting demonstration of this attitude comes from a children's picture book. Tom Corbett, A Trip to the Moon. This children's book involves Tom Corbett visiting two children and taking them on a trip to the moon. The interesting thing about this is that these are clearly contemporary children, that is, children of the 50s. The premise of this story is that the child watcher of Tom Corbett might be able to imagine him as existing in their own society. Perhaps this is also why so much of the stuff one would expect from a sci-fi series is lacking in Tom Corbett. There are no aliens, no autonomous robots, no monsters or mutants, no psychic powers. The technology seems curiously cautious. Apart from the space rockets themselves and ray guns, almost everything seems to be exactly as it was in the 50s, especially in the descriptions of everyday life. This is especially noticeable in the radio show and the books, which contain more world building, and they show a world where, with the exception of those things necessary for the premise, things are remarkably similar to an idealized 50s America. This feeling is strengthened by a factor that the franchise runners couldn't have accounted for. The show was made just before we began to send out space probes to bring us our modern understanding of the solar system. Hence, it contains many scientific errors that it could have avoided even a decade later. The solar system of Tom Corbett is the solar system of Martian canals, Venusian swamps and jungles filled with dinosaurs, and the twilight zone of Mercury, the mythological world of the first half of the 20th century, so cruelly broken by the cold reality of a dead solar system. It all helps strengthen the feeling that this is a show that belongs very firmly to a single era. I suspect all this might partly account for the fact that Tom Corbett was never revived, despite the fact that there were apparently plans to do so once the launch of Sputnik increased interest in shows about space travel. And I suspect this also ties into the reason why it is so little remembered today. It is so strongly a show of the 50s that it found it hard to go beyond them. But is this fair? Is there nothing worth remembering about Tom Corbett today? There is one thing I would like to say about Tom Corbett before I continue. I love it. It's great. Not just good for its time or any such backhanded compliment, but better than a lot of modern children's shows. It is a point of profound regret for me how little of the TV show remains. So, given that I have just explained why it's not entirely surprising that it is being forgotten, what do I love so much about it? Some of it is admittedly surface level and rather personal stuff. I love the feel of pre-space age sci-fi, the sort of thing you'll find in Disney's Man in the Moon being narrated by Werner von Braun, the sort of sci-fi that existed before the digital revolution, when everything was incredibly analog and ships contained spools of tape, and when Mars and Venus were still plausibly livable. Whether you like this or not is very subjective, but if you do, I suspect you'll like Tom Corbett. The special effects are primitive by modern standards, and the camera work, costumes, and general filming techniques are also pretty basic. Nevertheless, at the time they were quite innovative. The scenes depicting weightlessness are especially convincing, and the fact that they felt it necessary to bother depicting weightlessness illustrates the surprising devotion to scientific realism this show has. For example, the writers are clearly aware that once a rocket is moving in space, it will keep moving even if its engines shut off. I've watched much more recent shows that don't comprehend that simple point. In general, this show is surprisingly scientifically accurate whenever scientific progress has not left it behind, thanks to the services of Willie Ley, a fascinating science writer, as advisor. Another attractive feature is the acting. All of the actors are clearly putting their absolute all into it. This is most obvious with the main three, such as Frankie Thomas, who really is something as Tom Corbett. Yet many of the bit parts are also played with surprising dedication, and this sometimes elevates what would be rather mediocre characters. I'll take the villainous space pirate Jim Masters as an example. He's played by William Johnston, who is not someone you'll have heard of. In appearance, he isn't overly threatening, his costume is kind of lame, and even the name Jim Masters frankly does not inspire fear. But the character is acted with such menace that he comes off as frightening despite low production values. But the following scene highlights more than that. It occurs when Masters, having captured Roger, Dr. Dale and Captain Strong, is attempting to persuade Roger to come over to his side, and it really helps to find the characters of both Jim Masters and Roger himself.
Now they'll probably put Erickson's name on the scroll of honor. Maybe even give him a medal, yeah. The Solar Medal of Honor. Now that's for him. They always give the Solar Medal to dead heroes. So what's wrong with that? You know, I knew a guy once that got the Solar Medal. A guy by the name of Manning. Hey, that's a funny coincidence. Your name's Manning too, isn't it?
Stow it, Masters. You don't know what you're saying.
Hell, what are you getting so touchy about? Thought this story'd give you a kick. Now listen, this poor joker, Manning, he was out in a rocket scout with a cadet, a routine training flight. So something happens to one of the rocket tubes, see? Manning, playing the hero, goes out to fix it. And he floats away into space. When they finally found him, he was a dead hero.
All right, that's enough.
Hey, wait a minute. You haven't heard the really funny part of this story. You want to know who that cadet on that scout was? Me. You! Isn't that a laugh? That poor dumb joker. Sacrificing his life for me. Hey, I'll bet Manny's turning over in his grave right now. Got the Solar Award posthumously for saving the life of a guy that turned out to be a space pirate.
This could be an incredibly over-the-top and cliché villain speech, and in some ways it is, but the thing I really like, what elevates it beyond this, is the tone of absolute self-loathing in which William Johnston delivers the lines and laughter. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but to me, this really seems to show a man that on some level wishes he had died all those years ago before he could become a space pirate. After all, then he would be a dead hero, even though he has rejected the Solar Guard a part of him wishes he had stayed true to his youthful loyalties. None of this is really stated in the script, but the acting brings it out. He is at once both trying to convince Roger that the ideals of the solar god are worthless and the whole institution is just a load of baloney, while simultaneously regretting, though not truly repenting of, his betrayal of those ideals. And I find this quite fascinating given what has happened in the years since this show has been made. For the time between us and it has not been kind to many of the attitudes in this show and the unironic sincerity in which they are put forth. This is a show in which authority figures are good guys, in which society isn't to be rebelled against, in which government is to be, generally, obeyed. In other words, it's an American show from before the 60s. Since then, we have entered the age of deconstruction and cynicism about all these things. Ironically, Star Trek, itself a product of the 60s, is one of the last sci-fi shows where this optimism persisted. Not that Star Trek, at least in its later incarnations, believed that human society as it was worth anything, but it very clearly believed that it could become worth something. Modern Star Trek, of course, finds even this optimism increasingly hard to balance with the more cynical takes that are fashionable today. But even Star Trek, especially later Star Trek, is not willing to establish its future ideal civilization until it has first purged our own with nuclear fire. It is very debatable whether this is any sort of vote of confidence in our own society and culture. But Tom Corbett, as we have already established, is really a show about the 50s, idealised and thrusted to the future. So Tom Corbett can be taken as a sign of a civilization's confidence in its own ability to become an ideal of the future. It is a vote of confidence in the government and institutions of 50s America and their ability to develop into an ideal society. Since then, science fiction has become unremittingly negative about the potential of government and institutions. A modern piece of sci-fi is willing to admit that a single individual or small band of friends might be able to stand against evil and be a force for good in rebellion against society, but it will never admit that any society-wide institution can be positive. Governments, militaries, police forces, in a modern series they're all villains, though their individual members are often extremely valorized. Take the Hunger Games series. Katniss may be a noble fighter against tyranny in the capital, but District 13, the organisation she works for during the latter period of rebellion, is tyrannical and miserable. The story ends with her assassinating its leader and quitting for private life. It is rather ominous that a lot of modern media seems to reject the very concept of being uncynical about our institutions, or even seriously believing they can be improved. In this show, Roger is the cynic. He represents the modern point of view. Not that it is really modern. Every generation thinks it has invented cynicism about the institutions of its society. But as anybody who has studied the aftermath of World War I could tell you, we are hardly the first. He is constantly mocking the ideals of the Solar Alliance. He is constantly calling the members out for hypocrisy. As far as he is concerned, it is all just a scam to persuade naive young men to go to pointless deaths. Roger's own father was one of those naive fools. He died when Roger was just a kid. A heroic death, by all accounts, that got him given a medal and everything. As Roger puts it in the book, Stand By for Mars, all I had was a lousy hunk of gold, worth exactly 500 credits, a solar medal, and my mother, trying to scrape by on a lousy pension that was only enough to keep us going, but not enough to get me the extra things other kids had. It couldn't bring back my father. And what was the great heroic cause for which this child was left fatherless and this woman a widow? Well, we discovered that in the TV series, didn't we?
Hey, I'll bet Manny's turning over in his grave right now. Got the Solar Award. posthumously for saving the life of a guy that turned out to be a space pirate.
Roger has exactly one plan for his own service in the Solar Guard when he first joined, which is summed up in the first book when Tom witnesses him weeping before his father's old ship, preserved in a museum. He kept watching as Roger put away the handkerchief, saluted sharply and turned toward the slide stairs. Ducking behind the glass case that held the first spacesuit ever used, Tom held his breath as Roger passed him. He could hear Roger mumble, "They got you, but they won't get me with any of that glory stuff." To a modern person watching or reading Tom Corbett, Roger almost seems like an avatar of the inability of the modern world to make a show like Tom Corbett. Yet, I think that, like the pirate Jim Masters, though we loudly declare our disbelief in such ideals, a part of us still regrets that we do not still believe in them and feels, perhaps fears, that we would have been better people if we had not taken the easy path of cynicism and rebellion for its own sake. And make no mistake, this show has no doubt that being cynical about these things is wrong. Roger's character arc involves him realising this. It's actually a bit shocking to modern sensibilities at times. In the book The Revolt on Venus, we meet a bunch of rebels who are trying to gain independence for Venus from the Solar Guard, and they're the bad guys. In a modern story, such a group would likely be the heroes, but here, rebellion is not a good thing. Government can be an instrument of positive good, and fighting against it may not mean you're a cool rebel, but may simply mean you're a nasty criminal. Admittedly, the cadets do, at various points, find it necessary to disobey orders, especially in the books, but it's always in the interests of the greater ideals of the Solar Guard and not, ultimately, against the Solar Guard, and the Solar Guard leadership can't be persuaded to recognise this. This is an interesting moral statement in a genre where some might expect the moral stakes to be the more of the "should this mad scientist blow up the Earth with his moon laser" variety. Not that we don't get that too, of course.
Oh, yes. The moon ray. You don't know where it comes from, do you?
But you're going to tell us, Professor.
That's where you're wrong, Cadet. I'll tell you nothing. Within 2 hours, Solar City is going to be destroyed. And there's not anything that any one of you can do to stop it.
But that is also fun. Later on in the series, Roger is replaced with Thistle due to actor unavailability. Thistle lacks a great deal of depth and is more of a purely humorous character. Actually, judging from episodes that still exist, it seems that the series as a whole took on a more purely comedic turn towards the end, and these later episodes also seem to be a bit less successful. This is a shame, since most of the episodes that survive are later episodes. But even here, the series is often fun, and the unique moral alignment still shines through and makes it distinctive, even if, at the time, I doubt many watchers would have noted something so normal. It all gives Tom Corbett an enduring quality that, to me at least, makes it something valuable even after almost 70 years. So although I can't call it some great mystery or injustice that Star Trek has endured whilst Tom Corbett is all but vanished, if you want to take a quick look at a fun piece of sci-fi from the 50s, with a little more depth than is immediately apparent, I would check Tom Corbett out. Start with the books. They have all survived and are the easiest to get into, and they're free online. This series deserves to be remembered, at least a little. Tell me what you think about it. If you think it deserves a reassessment, or if you think it is deservedly forgotten. Until then, Spaceman's luck, cadets!
From the rocket fields of the Academy to the far-flung stars of outer space, we are space cadets training to in the sky, whistling fast, higher than high, faster than fast, out into space, into the sun. Look at her go when we give her the gun. We are the Space Cadets, and we are proud to say our fight for right will never cease. Like a cosmic ray, we light the way.